You are listening to the IFH Podcast Network. For more amazing filmmaking and screenwriting podcasts, just go to ifhpodcastnetwork.com.
Welcome to the Successful Screenwriter Podcast, where we discuss anything and everything screenwriting. Here we interview successful screenwriters and filmmakers to find out just what it takes to make it in the industry. Just a heads up, this episode is brought to you by my book, The Guide for Every Screenwriter, which has been listed as one of the best screenwriting books of all time by the Book Authority. If you're looking for something that reveals the secrets of screenwriting in an easy to understand and engaging way, then this is the book for you. You can find The Guide for Every Screenwriter at thesuccessfulscreenwriter.com/books. Now, on to the show. All right, welcome to the podcast. We have an awesome guest today, Deborah S. Patz. She is the author of Write, Shoot, Edit, a complete guide for teen filmmakers. Thanks for being on with us.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you very much.
Well, here's the cool thing. I have a teenager who's loves screenwriting and is interested in filmmaking, so I actually gave him your book.
Oh, excellent.
And Jonah read your book, and then he gave me a series of questions to talk with you about. I actually wanted to bring him on as a guest. He's like, it's your show, Dad. So.
Oh, that's so cool. Yeah.
So
well, that's definitely the primary audience is teenagers, because that's when I started making movies.
It's awesome. Yeah. So he's 15. So I have a bunch of questions for you from him as well. Before we get into that, I do want to get your origin story and kind of how you came into the business and into writing this book.
Sure. I actually started, my first movies was before I was a teenager at 9. My mom went to university and thought she was taking an easy credit for filmmaking. And that's when we actually had short ends because it was on film. And so I used to use short ends and go out and, give the dog some peanut butter and then talk for the dog in order to start making the very first movie.
That's
and
cute.
Then it sort of moved up from there. Then I started scripting murder mysteries, and then I started involving my friends. And I think by the end of high school, I did like a 20-minute murder mystery with cast of 15 from school. It was quite complex. And weirdly, my best friend starred against my brother's best friend, and they ended up marrying and having kids, but that's a side benefit. And but then I went into school. I went to York University for film school, dreamt of working for Spielberg and Lucas, but I lived in Canada, so I didn't think that would happen for many years. Went out into the film industry at Nelvana, where I started working at both animation and live action, because I also had some animation training. And then Spielberg and Lucas started doing films with Nelvana, so I ended up actually working with both of them.
Cool.
Weird. So then I went off and started doing all sorts of other things in the industry. I actually started gravitating towards the more organizing and business side of things. So my approach to script writing, even though I've trained in it at York and I also trained in it with an MFA at UBC, I still work with them moving scripts from writing into movies. So that tends to be my forte. And so I ended up writing a book about the business side of film first, which was Film Production Management 101, because that was never actually taught to me at university. But then eventually I came back to, I loved making movies when I was younger and that exploration. And so I ended up writing Write, Shoot, Edit, which is a bit of a choose your own adventure story. You read it either as a writer, a shooter, or an editor, and you read different chapters in different order. Because that's actually how we make movies.
Well, that was funny that you say that, because that's actually the very first question I have from my teen. And he said, why did she make it as a choose your own adventure style? And he wanted me to ask you that because I have him reading, he's read Master Shots. I mean, the kid's like really getting into it. So
yeah. Well, it's true. I started, as I worked through it, It took me many drafts before I actually got to that point.
Okay.
But really, from working in film, I know that you make a story 3 times. You write it once. When you direct it, it's a completely different headspace. And then when you're in the editing room, it's another headspace. So I just couldn't bring the 3 of them together entirely as one comprehensive book.
Yeah.
So I ended up doing it. And the interesting thing too is that although it is everybody reads 5 chapters, everybody ends up reading the visualizing a story chapter, but you come at it from a different background because of what you've learned from your perspective.
Yeah. No, I think that's cool. I mean, he definitely did. I have a bunch of dog ears in the book from him.
Oh, good.
So let's get into the book. You talk about the 3 heads of writing: the wild inventor, the doctor structure, and the nitpicky tweaker.
Yes. It's a lot of 3s in the book. There's the 3 paths you go on. When you actually get into every path, there's a reminder that everything you have to do, you're going to do a minimum of 3 times. And that's where I came up with this idea of you've got the first time, let's just take writing, because you can do it for any stage, but we'll take the writing side of things. The first draft is your wild inventor stage. And you don't want to limit yourself there. If you're going through and you start saying, oh, that's a bit cliche, forget it, just write it. Because you have to get right to the end of it. And that seems to be one of the biggest problems with new writers, is actually getting to the end of it, because at some point they start editing themselves. And from the writing that I've done, I've noticed that, I'll go through and I'll have this seething critic saying, oh, that's so awful. But I just put it aside and I say, you know what, you can come back and you can tell me in September, I actually have a schedule. This is when you're going to do it. And then, so they're like, okay, fine, I'll just wait. And when I get to the end, the style starts to come to me. So the last third of what I'm writing is actually not too bad. It's actually in the style that I want, because I've pushed through. And then when I get back and the next stage, which is the doctor structure editor, comes on board, it's amazing, but you actually end up reading the whole thing and it's like, oh, that's not so bad after. Oh, I see what you're doing, but I know how to fix it.
Yeah.
I can see that style. Well, now we can bring that style forward. And so that basically, the doctor can't come on board until you have the body.
There
so
you
you
go.
need the body with the first head. The second head is structure, really big issues of story structure, characters, and all that stuff. And the third time you want to go through it is when you're getting right into the details, which I've called nitpicky tweaker, which could be the copy editor. It could be the editor who's just taking out a frame here and there.
Yeah.
But it's no longer about switching whole scenes. It's about, the first thing you think of is typos, which is pretty obvious. Anybody can read the typos. But then it's like, is the character name the same all the way through? Is that character, when they refer back to the past, is the past actually there? So that it's the consistency and the continuity that comes in there.
I think that's cool. And there definitely are a lot of 3s in this book. One thing you talk about is visualizing a scene in 3 parts. I thought that was great. I like that you're teaching these kids how to think visually. So you talk about the entrance, the interaction, and the exit.
Exactly. Yeah. And the idea of you don't have to include all 3 parts of a scene. That really affects your pacing. If you have somebody come into the room, they deal with whatever they're dealing with in the room, and then they leave the room. And whether it's, enter the frame and leave the frame, it comes down to every detail level of that. And the idea in the book is that, I come at it from a professional filmmaker. So it's a matter of, you're not just learning how to make home movies, you're learning how to make movies the way we make them in Hollywood.
Yeah.
Other Hollywood places, the non-Hollywood places, because I'm based in Canada, although I deal with Hollywood a lot. So, you end up saying, okay, every scene's got these 3 parts, but maybe I can finish it in the middle of a scene and jump into the middle of another scene, and that will definitely speed up my pacing. But does it also, when I put those two together, does it also give me humor, or does it
Right.
make me cry because I actually see something where I've put two things together?
Well, I love that you just keep walking me into the next question.
Oh, okay.
So the next question was actually about action reaction and what you call the zigzag outline. I actually thought that was really great that you're teaching these kids how to not just set up a scene, not just different structure of it, but that every action should have a reaction, and those reactions need to be different. You need to have those ups and downs.
Yeah, I mean, from the director's point of view, you're always, you end up in the scene, you're both filming the action and the reaction at the same time. And sometimes what's happening is the story's actually in the reaction. It's not in the action itself. And you can see that with movies when,
Yeah.
if you don't have enough money, you can actually have somebody watch a
Right.
stunt that happens off screen and you do the
Right.
whole thing with sound. But it can be funny because the person that's watching that person's reaction is also going to be the audience's reaction. So, but at the same time, so when you bring that idea of action reaction into writing, now it's a matter of, well, there's the 3-act structure, which is one way of looking at it, but there's the zigzag storytelling, which I've also talked about, which is you'll have a positive action respond, and the next thing that'll come out of that will be a negative action, and comes out of that is a positive action. So let's just take Avatar, for example. Jake initially, he has he's got an accident. He can't walk,
Right.
and so that's a negative. However, and his brother has died, so that's a negative. But on the positive side, he ends up being able to take over the legacy of his brother because they were twins. So that's a positive. When he
Right.
gets there, they don't want him there because he's got the wrong training. It's a negative. However, because of his training, he can control his avatar faster than anybody else can. That's a positive. And so that whole idea of the up and down, rather than just item, 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 it's not episodic, it ends up
Yeah.
having a shape to it.
Yeah. It's definitely peaks and valleys. I think that's so important
Yeah.
for writers, like young writers out there, to know, and even writers that are just getting into it, is that you don't want to have a flat scene. You want to have a scene that emotionally keeps people invested in a journey as well. I think it's great. And again, walking me I did not give you these questions. It's crazy.
No, you didn't. It's amazing.
All right. Yeah, but no, we talked about
Yeah.
So he wanted to ask you about how characters undergo changes through scenes. And so that's something we just talked about, but maybe you can give me a little bit more on what those changes, what the ramifications of those changes are outside of positive, negative.
The important thing about this, I mean, and the important concept there is that there needs to be change in the scene. In that, if you can have a scene, and if it doesn't reveal more about the character, or it doesn't advance the plot, well, then you really don't need the scene there. You can just
Cut it.
imply it, cut it out, and move on. The teenage film that I was doing growing up, the one at the end of high school, we wanted to, we were teenagers and we wanted to do a car chase. And yeah, right, car chase. We'd only just got our licenses. Like, that's
awesome. Of course.
So we're at the train station. We have a bumbling cop. A character has been murdered right beside him, and he hasn't noticed because a train went by. But he sees the bad guy just get into his car and drive off. So there was supposed to be a car chase, but we realized we couldn't do that on the day, and we had to come up with something else. And so then it was a matter of, well, he's a bumbling cop. What if he's fumbling for his keys? So now we've got a scene where he sees the bad guy run away. He's fumbling through all his collection of keychains to try to find the key to get into his car, which is totally in character for him, but at the same time advances the plot because the bad guy gets away. and it takes them, and then it's going to take them longer in order to get there.
That's great.
So that whole idea that sometimes too, that shows you that you don't actually have to invent it in the script. You can invent it on the day if you have to actually make changes.
And that's fun. That's fun for me. I love that. And when there's a problem in the script and you can't come up with a solution, I love getting on board and brainstorming with that and really like, okay, how do we solve this problem? It's for me, I don't know. I get this electricity about it. I just did it yesterday with a client. It's so fun.
It is.
So you break down the 3-act structure into 4 parts. Looks like you have a 2A and a 2B. And I know some people do that. I haven't really discussed it too much on this show. So I wonder if you could walk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, we always talk about the 3-act structure, but every time you look at the 3-act structure, Act 2 is like twice as long as everything else. So really, it's actually 4 parts.
Yeah.
And so then it makes, and a lot of people end up talking about, oh, it was great, but there was sort of this mushy middle. And it's like, well, because it's twice as long. So what are you doing in the first half of Act 2, and what are you doing in the second act of Act 2? Well, the first act of Act 2, or the first part of Act 2, can be more reactionary because the main character is learning what new world they're in.
Yeah.
And the things that they have to deal with. And it can still be funny. You know, you can still have all the experimentation and all that, and trying to deal with all the reaction, because, you know, we tend, you know, when we react to things, there's a lot of story there. But at some point, they have to stop reacting and they have to start actually doing something. They have to start working, intentionally moving toward the climax.
Right.
And that's the second half of Act 2. So that's where you've got that sort of crisis moment in the middle, where they now have to decide. And typically, you'll find in the first half of Act 2, there's either a training scene, an excerpt practice scene.
Yeah.
There's dressing for the part scenes, stuff like that.
It's putting on the bat suit. So
putting on the bat, yeah.
So, do you have any tips for teen filmmakers out there, whether they're writers, editors, or directing?
Well, tips are to experiment and try. I mean, that's where I wrote the book. It's quite short in that, like I said, you only had to read 5 chapters. I mean, it's not a terribly long book. My other book is 500 pages, so that's why this one seems so much shorter. And the idea is to try something, and you don't necessarily have to try the whole thing. You can just try a portion. Like the first thing I did when I was making movies was the dog and the peanut butter. The second thing I did was a commercial for beans, and that's because I had beans covered and we had a pot and we had some friends, and we just, like, you know, we went, okay, we'll invent it. And so every time you try something new. And then the next one was sort of a 5-minute murder mystery with 2 characters in it.
Yeah.
And that's where I started working with like film noir experimentation. And then every time you film something, it feeds back to the beginning, so that you begin to get better at writing at the same time, because you see how a script is never intended to stay as a script.
Yeah.
It's going to become a movie at some point. So you have to see how it translates from script into movie. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to shoot your own films.
Right.
You can share that with other people, if somebody else who wants to try to do that. Or you can try and shoot somebody else's script.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask you is, because this was one of my son's big concerns, is because he's savvy and he knows how expensive equipment is. And I said, just use your cell phone. Just use the cell phone. Just use your cell phone. See if you like the process. You know, we don't need to go buy a red.
There is no film I've ever worked on that had enough money and time. And I've done IMAX 3D, and I've shot with NASA in space, and they still didn't have enough money. I mean, I remember when we did an IMAX 3D drama, huge budget, and I would be talking to people going, I'm sorry, we just, you know, this is the most I can pay. It wasn't bad. It wasn't horrible pay, but it wasn't. I would love to have paid more. But some of the logistics in IMAX 3D was the film stock came from, because it was film stock too, came from New York to Canada. After we shot it on the day, then we had to put it into lead cases, fly it to Los Angeles to process. After it got processed and they did the negative check in Los Angeles, we had to fly the film to Montreal where there was a 3D theater, and then the crew from Toronto to Montreal in order to watch it.
Wow.
That's how we would do the dailies. Well, that's terribly expensive. And that's part of the reason that the movie would cost so much. So you'll never, ever have enough time and money. So it's the idea of what can you do with the limit that you have? And if you've only got a cell phone, fine, figure out how to do it with a cell phone. You know, the first thing I did, I had short ends. So I had little clips of film that would be like, this one's only 20 seconds long. I can't have a shot longer than 20 seconds.
Wow.
So you have to work at it from there.
And finally, do you have any, I should ask you this. Is there anything I didn't ask you that I should have asked you?
Show don't tell is one of those things that everybody talks about. And that is another thing that I talk about in the book. I also give, I think, like 6 different ways of dealing with it. Because as you're writing a story, as you're writing the script, it's really easy, especially if you've read lots of novels and you haven't been reading lots of scripts, is to include thoughts. And in order to, workshopping it with other people is really useful in order to read through it, because then you can find some of those moments where, oh, that's actually not coming across. But I think I give like 6 different ways of dealing with it. One of them being just cut it out, because you're not going to see it anyway. But it's a good thing to practice, to actually go through, and you can actually even take it from a novel that you're reading and say, okay, how much of this stuff can I actually see or actually hear?
Yeah. Because
that's the only thing that you can do in a film. Harry Potter did a great example of that, where in the book, Hermione at a certain point says, I had to obliviate my parents. And it was a very powerful moment in the book because she was finally revealing it to Harry. But in the book, we're listening to everything from Harry's point of view. Once you get to a movie, it's no longer one person's point of view.
Right.
You're immediately in third person. And so what they did in the movie is they actually filmed the moment silent of her erasing herself from her parents' lives. And you feel it emotionally so much more because you're watching it.
Yeah.
And so that's a moment where, oh, okay. And that's why sometimes the books and the movies can't match.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a different thing writing screenplays.
Hey, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter by using my handle @ScreenwriterPod. And if you liked the show, please support it by subscribing and sharing the episode on your social media.